Hi, everybody. This is Introduction to Counseling, and we're going to be talking about ethics in counseling. Okay, so let's get started. You're going to take a whole course in ethics when you get to grad school, whether that's in social work or counseling or some related field like substance abuse and so on. Yeah. And it's important you understand that even after that, you will, as part of your license, annually be required to take continuing education training in ethics. It's that big of a deal, and I'm glad we've moved in that direction. For licensed professional counselors, which is a big hunk of the counselors that see people, you have to have 6 face-to-face hours of training in ethics every year. So look, therapists are human. Big surprise, huh? We're not mechanical, we're humans. And humans are fallible. Humans make mistakes, sometimes even with the best intentions. And ethical guidelines provide guidance for our behavior as counselors, and they provide for accountability for those recommendations. Okay? So we need them, don't we? We need them. We need them partly because the therapeutic alliance and relationship is very unbalanced. You've got a lot of power and they have less. You know them, they don't know you. This is a big potential problem for the abuse of power. Maybe in an unaware way, maybe an unconscious way, but of course we're very, very worried about those who would misuse that power deliberately. Look, the therapeutic relationship is very complicated. The issues that the client brings are complicated. The nature of the relationship is complicated. It's a very strange relationship in that you're focused on them in a way they've probably not experienced before. It's a very intimate kind of thing that they experience, believe it or not. And I mean by that closeness, trusting, and they don't know you. So, boy, the relationship is complicated. Okay, there are things that you don't talk about, mainly you, much at all. You better not, anyway. Otherwise, you got to pay them, right? Okay. So, what are ethical codes? Well, codes are the guidelines that counselors have that depicts what they can and can't do, ways to handle problems, approaches to handling problems, and they are set forth in every organizational body and every licensing organization, such as the American Counseling Association, the American Psychological Association, and then licensed professional counselors have their own ethical guidelines. National Association of Social Workers and licensed clinical social workers have their own guidelines, okay? Now, these are sometimes things labeled as one set in stone, don't do this. Okay, you don't date your clients, for example. You don't do that. It's illegal, for one thing. It's horrible. Don't do that. But they're rarely set in stone. They're more about approaching situations and how you should interpret the guidelines that are offered to help you work through some of the issues you will face that are ethics problems. So here are some areas, just general areas, okay, that tell you about some of the issues. One is competence. So, for example, you can only provide services for which you are qualified, meaning you're trained and educated in that area. Second is client welfare. So the client's needs come before yours, and you always have to act in their best interests. Second is informed consent. So you have to inform clients regarding your training, your education, and the nature of counseling and the nature of confidentiality. Okay? That's a document they read and sign, and they get a copy with you first session before you do anything else. Some specific areas include confidentiality. So clients have to be free to discuss whatever they want to discuss. Now, there are limits to that. We'll talk about in a minute. Dual relationships. You can only be their counselor and should avoid any other kinds of contact or relationships with them. So you can't counsel friends or relatives. You can't counsel students if you're a teacher. You should not counsel family members. But if you're a counselor in a small town and there's one cabinet maker and you're building a house and they're the only ones that can build the cabinets. Is that okay? Well, at every opportunity, avoid it. Order your cabinets. Sexual relationships, don't have them with clients ever, ever. Okay. And then let's talk about competence and malpractice specifically. So we can only provide the services for which we're qualified, educated, and trained. That's the first thing I said. The second thing is you have to represent your qualifications and credentials in your informed consent. You have to keep current in the field, okay, especially in whatever your specialty area is. Keep up to date. And then seek counseling if you need it for your own issues. That's all about competence. Okay. Now, malpractice occurs when you don't provide reasonable care that other professionals would provide, and it results to some kind of injury to the client, emotional or otherwise. There are 4 conditions that have to be met to establish malpractice. I thought you would be interested to know this. One is the counselor had a duty to the client, and that occurs in the first session. Once you start talking to them, you have a duty to them. The duty of care was not met. You didn't meet that duty of care in a reasonable way. And as a result, the client was injured in that process. And there was a relationship that is causal between what you did and didn't do, did or didn't do, and therefore your failure to provide reasonable care, and that's what resulted in the client injury. Okay? Now that informed consent is important. I've mentioned it twice, so let's talk about what it is. It talks about the things I mentioned, plus the cost of counseling, the nature of treatment, and if it's experimental, you have to indicate that and get their consent and be very clear about it being something that's not established. You have to talk about confidentiality and its limits. In confidentiality and its limits, you need to know that that there is a protection that is legal in confidentiality for the client. That protection belongs to the client, and it prevents you as a counselor from disclosing things that the client has said. It is the right that belongs to the client, not the counselor. Now, the laws regarding what is and what is not what we call a privileged communication varies from state to state and at the federal level. It varies. But in general, there are some limits that people agree upon state to state and at the federal level, based on Tarasoff versus Board of Regents of University of California. This is decades old, but it came on the heels of a lawsuit being brought when a counselor who heard someone report that there would be harm to someone after the session didn't report it, and that harm was something that occurred. So we have something called the duty to report. So when a client is suicidal that you assess, there's a way to assess that, then you have to tell the client about, based on what I told you in the first session on the informed consent about the limits of confidentiality, I want to make sure you're safe. And so based on what you're telling me that you're planning on doing, which is hurting yourself or killing yourself, I need to find a way to have you be in the hospital. It's not just for me, it's for you. It's for you. We don't want you to hurt yourself. And so you have to have a way to do that, and there's a whole protocol to do that. So we have a duty to warn. If a client is suicidal, if the client needs hospitalization, if someone's going to hurt or kill somebody else, if they get up and leave the session after telling you they're going to go kill somebody, if you've heard who it is and so on, then you have to notify that person, and then also call the sheriff's department. That they would already know all that. You would establish with them what the limits to confidentiality are, and the confidentiality are in the first session. Yes. Now there are other limits. One is when you're doing a court-ordered evaluation of a client. If the client sues you, if the client uses a mental disorder as a legal defense and your records are subpoenaed, if any time the court subpoenas your records, when an underage child is being abused, when a client is being specific about imminently committing a crime. Okay? Anytime the court orders your records, that's the end of it. But the records otherwise don't belong to the client. You should always write your notes and compose reports based on the assumption someone else is going to read those, maybe even the client or a court at some point in the future. Okay? Always remember that. So they need to be complete, and they need to be accurate and unbiased. And there's a way to include information that is inferred and not objective completely, but your notes need to be, by and large, completely unbiased. Okay? Now, dual relationships. Well, this is where you have guidance from the guidelines. Okay? So the first question he asks is it necessary to have this dual relationship? Is there any way to avoid it? Is it in any way exploitive? Based on which direction? Is that cabinet maker, who's the only cabinet maker in town, going to see your house, and is that a problem? And where you live, is that a problem? And yes, could be. You may not even know it at the time. Is it a problem if they decide they want to give you Uber cabinets and countertops and give you a low cost? Is that a problem? Yes. Charge you too much? Yes. For a lot of problems here. Who does it benefit, in other words? Does it benefit both, or only one, or is it uneven? Is there a risk that it could damage the client? Is there a risk that it could disrupt the therapeutic relationship in some way? Am I being objective in my evaluation of this matter? Unconsciously, you may need and want great cabinets, and the client says, I'll give you wholesale on this. If we can just trade out some sessions, I'll give you the best stuff, my cost. I won't even charge you labor. There's a part of you that wants to go, okay. No. Have you documented in your records, after deciding there's no way around this, that you've decided to do that? Because if you didn't write it down, it didn't happen. Always write it down, whatever the issue is, whatever important thing it is you discussed in therapy, write it down. Does the client give informed consent as to this necessary temporary dual relationship? It should really only be temporary, if it's necessary. Now let's talk about physical touch. Let's do that in the next video, okay? All right.